Hey guys, so today we have AMSCO Chapter 4, which is going to start with the founding of New France and take us all the way up to the end of the French and Indian War and the proclamation of 1763. So we haven't talked much about France. We started with the Spanish and then talked about the English founding Jamestown and then the 13 colonies. The French have their first North American settlement at Quebec in 1608, which is up in what is now Canada. Initially, they become friends with a group of Indians, which sounds like a good thing. So they befriend the Huron. The problem is the Huron are enemies with the very powerful Iroquois Confederacy. So right off the bat, the French settlers are going to have trouble with the natives that they're having to fight against. New France, so when we talk about New England, just like New England, we have New France. That is what they're calling their North American colonies. They're very autocratic. They're all royal colonies, so they're directly controlled by the French crown. There's no representative assemblies like House of Burgesses or town meetings. There's none of that. It's all very autocratic. And compared to the English colonies, there's very slow immigration. There's just not a whole lot of French people moving to New France. They are much more focused on their sugar islands in the West Indies and the Caribbean because that's where their money is coming from. So here's a map that shows, here's the 13 colonies. Obviously, those are British. Spanish holdings, they do still have Florida, Mexico, land in the Southwest, and then the yellow here would be the French. So up here in Canada, this really important territory down the Mississippi River, including New Orleans, that we're going to have a war over here in just a minute. So France, it's going to spread out. Sorry, that made me laugh. One, Justin Bieber is Canadian, and beaver, you get it. So the main source of the economy in New France was beaver pelts. They would spread out across Canada in search of beaver to use for their pelts. So trappers roamed around. They recruited natives to help them in the fur trapping. Some missionaries, so this is something that's similar to the Spanish, that they would try to convert the natives. Jesuits are Catholic missionaries, and they're trying to convert natives. Not all that successful, but they are attempting to do that, more so than probably the English. They found several notable cities now. Detroit, LaSalle sails down the Mississippi to Louisiana. The port of New Orleans is going to become very important, and the English are really going to want that as an access point to the Gulf of Mexico and the ocean. It mentioned in AMSCO several previous wars that we had Queen Anne's War, that the British and the French are fighting each other multiple times leading up to the French and Indian War. They're able to gain some land, so that northern part of Canada they take. So this part right up here, the British are able to take that from France. This period is really important. So for several decades after those initial skirmishes, this period for the colonies is called salutary neglect. It's where England is basically leaving them alone and letting them do whatever they want. The problem is they're going to get used to this and they really like it. And then when England decides to stop leaving them alone and enforcing taxes, that's when things get bad. My favorite war, this one's fun, War of Jenkins' Ear, named for the British captain who got his ear cut off by the Spanish. This is another one of those small skirmishes that kind of erupts into a larger war leading up to the American Revolution. This one is mainly fought out in the ocean and in Georgia, where Georgia does their job and fends off the Spanish from Florida. George Washington enters the scene. So the reasons for the French and Indian War, the main reason is land disputes in the Ohio River Valley, that the French feel like they have a right to it, but there's these really rich families, including George Washington's family, we call them the first families of Virginia, who think they have the right to 500,000 acres in the Ohio River Valley. The reason they all want it is it's excellent farmland. It's a river valley, it's fertile, so they all want this land. The French start building forts there, so George Washington, who's 21 years old at the time, is sent with troops to secure his and other families' claims that they think they have to this land. The French leader is killed. Washington is forced to retreat. So really his first battle as a leader, he's forced to retreat. They are eventually successful. They start to kick out Acadians. So that area that they took from the French in some of those earlier wars, They kick them out. Many of them travel even as far south as Louisiana, and these are the people that we call the Cajuns. Now, that's where they came from, all the way up in Canada when the British kicked them out. So there you go. That's where we get Cajuns. So it erupts. The French and Indian War is really the fourth war between the British and the French. I know the name sounds confusing because you would think it's the French fighting against the Indians. That is not the case. It's the French and the British fighting each other with the help of various Indian tribes on both sides. So there's Indian tribes that are fighting for the French, for the British, and they're all fighting each other. This is called the 7 Years' War in world history. That may be what you refer to it as. So it's going on in Europe too. This is just like the North American theater of this larger world war that is going on. So the Albany Congress, I have a couple red terms here. This one is really important. So they call all the colonies together. Only 7 of them show up. So that shows you how lacking we were in colonial unity at the start of the French and Indian War. Couple of goals for this one. Number 1, appease the Indians, the Iroquois, so that they are loyal to the British. We don't want them to turn on them and side with the French. Sorry, I don't know what that noise is. Colonial unity, that's the big one. So Benjamin Franklin, this is his famous drawing of the snake that he put in the newspaper. These are all the different colonies, and it's all chopped up because if we don't join together, we're all going to die. So that was thanks to Ben Franklin. They want to promote colonial unity, which they just don't have much of at this point. They all view themselves as separate colonies, not as one united group. He does have a plan for home rule. It's a little premature. It's shot down by his fellow colonists and by Britain, but he is looking ahead to what will come to pass after the American Revolution for Americans ruling themselves from home. So the British have some trouble initially. There's General Braddock. He's a big failure. Major losses at Fort Duquesne, and he ends up being killed. Out on the frontier after this major loss, a lot of Indian tribes go on the warpath. There's scalpings happening all over the frontier, western Pennsylvania down into Virginia. It's just chaos on the frontier. Luckily, they get a better leader. William Pitt is going to be much more successful for the British than Braddock was. They launch an invasion of Canada. It does not go well. They try to attack too many forts at once instead of focusing on Quebec or Montreal, so it's major defeat there. So things are not going well for the British. William Pitt, yes, like armpit, he's a leader in the London government. Under his leadership, the British start to turn the tide. So Louisbourg is the first British victory, Quebec, Montreal. After Montreal falls, this is the big significance. That's why it's in red. The French are kicked off the continent. You'll see a map here in just a minute. This is the effect of the French and Indian War, is that the British kicked the French off the continent altogether. So the Louisiana Territory, so what we will purchase eventually from France, is going to go to Spain for now. It goes back to France later. Florida is going to go to Britain, so that kind of defeat or accomplishes the coastline for the British. It goes all the way down to Florida. So here's a map. Notice yellow, I know it's kind of grainy. Yellow is the French territory. This is pre-war boundaries. Post-war, it is gone. There is no more yellow. So all of this purple belongs to the British, including Florida down here. This is Spanish territory. We'll go back to the French later for us to buy it from them in 1803. Effects. The colonists are feeling pretty good about themselves after the French and Indian War, that they were able to help win this war against the very powerful French. They feel pretty confident in their abilities. They also notice that the British are not invincible. So you know that's in the back of their mind when the American Revolution breaks out, that they might be beatable. They're not quite as powerful of a military force as everybody thought. There are tensions, so colonial troops and British troops serve together during the war. They don't like each other. The British troops think the colonists are hillbillies. The colonists think the British officers are snobs. So there's tension that's going to continue to grow. And this is a problem. So a lot of the colonists continue to trade with France and Spain during the war. So they're like feeding the enemy, which is really going to upset the British for good reason. That's really not cool. But it just shows that they weren't invested in the war. They don't feel this unity, that they're more interested in making money than fighting in the war. So the big question at this point, with all these factors dividing the colonies, and you did the Zillow presentations, you know, some of these colonies have nothing in common. Like Puritans in Massachusetts and rice farmers in South Carolina really don't have a whole lot binding them together. But the French and Indian War is really starting to break down those boundaries to put us on the road to the American Revolution. So the French are gone, colonies start to branch out. This is not good for the natives because they used to be able to kind of pit the French and the British against each other to negotiate between the two, but now that negotiating power is gone with the French, so they have to deal directly with the British. In response to that, we have this guy named Chief Pontiac who leads rebellions on the frontier in the Ohio River Valley. So Pontiac's Rebellion, 1763. This is where some of the colonial leaders, British leaders, use biological warfare. They infect blankets with smallpox and distribute those to the natives in an attempt to suppress the rebellion. Settlers, even after Pontiac's Rebellion, are continuing to move west. So this land that was taken in the Ohio River Valley, they're flocking out there like it's Black Friday to go claim this land so that they can farm on it. The problem is things like Pontiac's Rebellion are threatening people who are moving out west. So the British passed the Proclamation of 1763, which they say, stop, no more Black Friday. They shut the doors. They say, you cannot settle west of the Appalachian Mountains, which to the colonists looks like they're just telling them what to do. We just helped you fight and win this war, and now you're telling us we can't go claim the land that we won. Whereas the British just see it as they're protecting them from the Indian clashes. So either way, the colonists are not happy about this. If you're a Friends fan, you will understand this reference. That's how they felt about the British because of the Proclamation of 1763. It's not good. Mercantilism. This is just a review because we've talked about this. Remember, the whole point of mercantilism is colonies give mother colony raw materials so that they can make finished products to make money. This was implemented way back in 1650, so we're past this point, but the first one was passed in 1650 to keep the Dutch from taking over trade with the British colonies. So they start making all these rules that make it harder for the colonies to trade with anyone but Britain. So you can only use their ships, or if you trade with France or Spain, you have to pay an extra tax to Britain. All of it is aimed at benefiting England. That's the whole point of mercantilism. So all these problems start developing. There's not enough currency in the colonies. They start printing their own paper money, but then it becomes worthless. So they are like, don't have any currency to trade with. Then they make a new law that you can't even print paper money. So the colonies just feel totally hopeless. Like nothing they do is working. So they also, any laws that are passed in the colonies, there's a privy council, a royal council that can veto any colonial law. So basically they have zero power whatsoever, and that is infuriating. So until 1763, we're in that period of salutary neglect, which sounds like a bad thing, but it's not. In this case, the neglect is good because the colonies like being left alone to trade with whoever they want. They smuggle like crazy, they just ignore the laws altogether, and the British don't do anything about it. Benefits for the colonists, it wasn't all negative. They do enjoy a monopoly, so especially the Chesapeake colonies, Virginia and Maryland, that trade tobacco, they have the monopoly over trade with the British, and the British are huge buyers of tobacco. And they have the protection of the British Army and Navy for free. So their ships are protected. When there's Indian threats on the frontier, the British Army is supposed to protect the colonists. So that's some benefits. But there are more disadvantages. So there's no economic initiative. If you know you can't really advance economically because you're stuck in this lose-lose trade relationship, what is your motivation? They can't buy, sell, ship, manufacture under the most favorable conditions because they have to do what the British are telling them to do. And they feel used, just like this roll of toilet paper. They feel so used and they don't like it. So if you haven't noticed, it's one thing after another, after another, after another, inching us closer to the American Revolution, to where the colonists just get fed up with Britain and say, forget it. So here we are with the taxes. The reason for the taxes is the French and Indian War. So because of the French and Indian War, the British are in debt. They believe the colonists should cover that cost because after all, it was the colonists that they were defending in the French and Indian War. So the new Prime Minister, George Grenville, orders that the navigation laws be enforced. This means no more salutary neglect. And the colonists are like, what? What are you talking about? So the first one that is passed, there are a lot of these, but I'm going to ask you to remember 3. Because if you ever get a question, like a short answer, asking you to give examples of taxes that led to the American Revolution, these 3 would work. The first one is the Sugar Act. This is just what it sounds like. Increase the tax on foreign sugar. The colonists freak out, they protest, and England backs off. They're like, whoa, okay. So they reduce it. Next is the Quartering Act. This requires colonists to provide food and quarters, like let them stay in their house for British troops. Extremely unpopular. And then the Stamp Act. This is the worst one yet, and it causes the biggest uproar in the colonies. This is not a tax on stamps. It is a tax that requires you to purchase a seal, like a special seal stamp for a lot of commonly used goods. So this one really affects a lot of the colonists and they don't appreciate it. So they're angry. They feel they're personally attacked. There's these courts that they set up. If you violate these acts, you're guilty until proven innocent. There are no juries. So basically, if you violate either of these acts, you're guilty automatically. The colonists are suspicious. They don't know what the British are up to. They feel like they should have representation in Parliament. This famous slogan, no taxation without representation. This is where that comes in. The English Parliament argues that they have virtual representation, that even though they're not living in England, they don't get to vote, that we're still representing your interests. That kind of goes back to that Jamestown rights of Englishmen. Like, you're still Englishmen, even though you're across the ocean, and we're still representing you, but they don't feel that way with these taxes. So the way you're going to remember these: sugar, quarter, like Quartering Act, not actual quarter, but Quartering Act. Stamp Act, angry colonists. So I'm going to do it a couple more times. Sugar, quarter, stamp, lion. Sugar, quarter, stamp, lion. So if on the AP exam, they want 3 examples of taxes that angered the colonists building up to the Revolution: Sugar Act, Quartering Act, Stamp Act, angry colonists. There's not a lion act. That's just angry colonists. So one more time: sugar, quarter, stamp, lion. Got it. Okay. So the colonists are livid about the Stamp Act. They call another Congress. So we had the Albany Congress. Now we have the Stamp Act. More show up this time. We're at 9 out of 13. They list their statement of grievances. So these are all their list of things they're mad about to send to England. This is a big step. So another step toward this unity. The colonies are coming closer and closer together, building up to the Revolution. Sorry. Non-importation agreements. So this is just what it sounds like. They agree not to import or purchase British goods. And this works. It hurts the British economy because the colonists are not going to buy their products. They start having spinning bees where they make their own clothing and things like that so that they don't have to buy it from the British. Sons and Daughters of Liberty, this is where they start functioning. Anyone who violates the boycott or tax collectors would be tarred and feathered, which is about as horrible as it sounds. They would pour hot tar on your body and then cover you with feathers till you looked like a giant chicken. I have a picture in a minute. So even in England, they start to demand that they repeal this because manufacturers in England are hurting because their colonists aren't buying their goods. And it is repealed by Parliament. So it's successful that they're able to get that repealed. So here's tarring and feathering. Looks lovely, right? So tar, feathers, dumped it on his head. Not fun. All right, we're almost there. Things are heating up. So as soon as they repeal the Stamp Act, the British pass the Declaratory Act, which is basically doesn't do anything except it says that they have a right to bind the colony. So yeah, we're repealing the Stamp Act, but we're still in charge of you. Don't let that fool you. We still get to tell you what to do. So a new leader in Parliament, the Townshend Acts are passed. These are significant because you notice one of those is on tea, which is going to lead to a very significant event. So they start smuggling tea because they don't want to pay the taxes. Troops are sent to Boston to keep order and violence breaks out. So the Boston Massacre, No one knows how it really started. There was a crowd throwing snowballs at the redcoats. Someone started shooting. 5 people are killed, including Crispus Attucks, who was the famous mulatto man who was killed as a leader of the group. 2 redcoats end up being prosecuted, but all that happens, they get like branded on the hand, and that's their whole punishment. So really nothing happens. This is a famous engraving done by Paul Revere that's going to circulate. Really, it's propaganda. I don't know if you can tell from here, but there's like blood spewing out of all of these people, really to build support for the cause for independence. Like the redcoats are murdering people in cold blood in Boston to build support for the revolution. King George, there he is. He is very young at the time. He's 32. He's surrounded by all these yes men that just tell him what he wants to hear. They do repeal the Townshend Acts except for the tea, which is going to be the problem. Committees of correspondence. Samuel Adams helps to start those. They spread propaganda. They exchange ideas. Just what it sounds like, groups of people corresponding with each other between the different colonies. And it's a forerunner of the Continental Congress that's going to come in the next chapter. So here's the tea. We got to dump it in the harbor before we finish up. So British East India Company is facing bankruptcy. So in order to help them not go under, the British say, okay, let's just get rid of the tea at a cheap price so that you don't go bankrupt. The Americans think it's a trick to try to force them to pay the tax on tea. So they don't like it. So they decide to dump it all in the harbor, led by Samuel Adams and several other of the Sons of Liberty. They dress as Indians, they jump on the boat and dump 342 chests of tea into the harbor in Boston. This isn't the only place that this happens. It's the one we always talk about, but there are other tea parties in Charleston and in Maryland. This is just by far the largest. So Parliament is angry, rightfully so. They just wasted 300 something tons of tea or barrels of tea. They passed the Intolerable Acts. The main goal of these is to punish the colonies, especially Massachusetts. So they close the harbor at Boston. Sorry, they crack down on self-government. They limit town meetings. It's like crack down on the colonists. At the same time, the Quebec Act is passed, which really doesn't have anything to do with all of this. It's just really bad timing because the colonists think it has something to do with this. This guarantees those former French colonies, that area of New France that was taken after the French and Indian War, it allows the French that are still living there some rights. So they get to keep their Catholic religion, they extend the boundary. The colonists freak out about this. They don't like that the former French are extending down into the Ohio River Valley. The anti-Catholic Anglican colonists don't like that Catholicism is spreading or being protected. So it's just bad timing in the middle of all this other craziness. So we are officially at this point on the road to revolution. Things are heating up. All of these red terms, I know there were a lot in this chapter, could be on a timeline leading up to the revolution. So revolution's like right here. Here we are, we're zooming fast, getting there. All right, that's it. If you have any questions, let me know. Just shoot me an email, and I hope y'all have a great day.